Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire. What do you get when you mix a puppet king, a power-hungry butler, a hammer-wielding warlord, and a man who thought converting pagans was a full-time job? You get the wild, glorious, and occasionally absurd rise of the Carolingian Empire. A tale of blood, faith, bureaucracy, and one very unexpected Christmas gift. But how did a kingdom ruled by ceremonial kings and squabbling mayors become the most powerful force in Europe? Why did Charles Martel earn the nickname the Hammer of God? And what exactly did he smash? What made the Battle of Tours so legendary that some say it saved Christianity itself? Who was Charlemagne, really? A ruthless conqueror, a scholarly saint, or just a guy who couldn't quite master Latin until his later years? How did he manage an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, while launching a renaissance, reforming the church, and dodging Viking raids? And what happened when a pope tried to blind his enemies, fled to Charlemagne for help, and then crowned him emperor without asking first? This is the story of From Household Chaos to Imperial Glory, the rise of Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, a saga of ambition, faith, betrayal, and legacy that shaped the future of Europe. Stick around because by the end of this video, you'll know why Venice nearly sparked a war with Byzantium, how an elephant became a diplomatic weapon, and what Charlemagne's empire has to do with lowercase letters and question marks. In the 7th and early 8th centuries, the Frankish kingdom was a hot mess. The Merovingian kings, descendants of Clovis, still wore the crown, but they had all the power of a decorative garden gnome. The real authority lay with the mayor of the palace, a glorified chief of staff who ran the royal household and, eventually, the entire kingdom. But here's the twist. There were two mayors, one for Austrasia, the eastern part, and one for Neustria, the western part. One was hereditary, the other a political battleground. And instead of fighting for the throne, nobles fought over who got to be the top butler. Then someone had the brilliant idea to give both mayoralties to an 8-year-old boy named Theudowald. Predictably, this went about as well as giving a toddler the nuclear codes. Amid the chaos, a man named Charles Martel, illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal, escaped imprisonment, rallied the Austrasian nobles, and began hammering his way through the opposition. Literally, by 718, Charles had defeated his rivals and was given the title Duke and Prince of the Franks by King Chilperic II, who, let's be honest, was more of a ceremonial mascot than a monarch. Charles Martel didn't bother with royal titles. He ruled as mayor of the palace, but everyone knew who was really in charge. He centralized power, built a professional army, but not everything was rosy. The Duchy of Aquitaine, once part of the Frankish realm, had broken away during the Civil War. Worse, it was now being invaded by the Umayyad Caliphate, the largest and wealthiest empire on earth at the time. The Umayyads had already conquered Spain and were now eyeing southern Gaul. Aquitaine's Duke Odo was getting steamrolled and had no choice but to ask Charles for help. Charles agreed, on one condition: Aquitaine must submit to Frankish authority. Charles mobilized his army and met the Umayyads near Tours, in a battle so famous it has 3 names: Battle of Tours, Battle of Poitiers, and Battle of the Highway of the Martyrs. The Umayyads, led by Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, had cavalry, numbers, and momentum. Charles had discipline, terrain, and heavy infantry. He positioned his troops in a dense phalanx on a wooded hill. The Umayyads charged repeatedly but couldn't break the line. Odo's cavalry flanked the enemy camp, causing panic. Abd al-Rahman was killed trying to rally his troops. The Umayyads retreated. Europe exhaled. Historians still debate the battle's significance. Did it save Christianity, halt Islamic expansion, or just stop a really big raid? Either way, Charles Martel emerged as the savior of Western Europe. Charles died in 741, dividing the realm between his sons Carloman and Pepin the Short. Carloman retired to a monastery in 747, leaving Pepin as sole ruler. In 751, Pepin asked Pope Zachary a loaded question: should the man who holds the power be king, or the man who wears the crown? Zachary replied, "Let the one who has the power be king." And just like that, Pepin was crowned king of the Franks, founding the Carolingian dynasty. He helped the Pope against the Lombards, carved out territory in Italy, and gave it to the Church, creating the Papal States. Pepin died in 768, dividing the kingdom between his sons Charlemagne and Carloman. Carloman died mysteriously in 771, leaving Charlemagne as sole ruler. Now, who was this man? Born around 742, likely in Aachen or Liège, Charlemagne was the eldest son of Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Laon. His name, Carolus Magnus in Latin, means Charles the Great, and history would prove it prophetic. He was raised in a court steeped in politics, warfare, and faith, tutored in Latin, Greek, military strategy, and Christian doctrine. Charlemagne grew into a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing eyes, a commanding voice, and a mind as sharp as his sword. He was multilingual, charismatic, and utterly ruthless when needed. The Frankish kingdom was split between Charlemagne and his younger brother Carloman, but Carloman died mysteriously in 771, leaving Charlemagne as sole ruler. And from that moment, the world would never be the same. Charlemagne spent most of his reign at war, and each campaign was a masterclass in strategy, diplomacy, and sheer force. The Lombard campaign, 773 to 774. Charlemagne had married the daughter of King Desiderius of the Lombards, but when the alliance soured, he sent her packing and invaded Italy. Desiderius had attacked Rome, so Charlemagne marched south, besieged Pavia, and captured Desiderius, declaring himself king of the Lombards and patrician of the Romans. This wasn't just conquest, it was a declaration. Charlemagne would be the sword of the church. The Saxon Wars. The war with the Saxons was like trying to swat a hornet's nest with a feather. It dragged on for over 30 years, with Charlemagne launching 18 campaigns between 772 and 804. The Saxons were fierce, stubborn, and deeply pagan. They worshipped sacred trees, refused baptism, and had a knack for rebellion. Then came Widukind, a charismatic Saxon noble who rallied the tribes like a rock star with a battle axe. In 782, Widukind led a surprise attack at the Battle of Centel, annihilating a Frankish force and killing several of Charlemagne's top commanders. Charlemagne was not amused. He returned with fury and ordered the infamous massacre of Verdun, executing 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. It was brutal, controversial, and effective. By 785, Widukind had had enough. He surrendered and accepted baptism, symbolically submitting to Charlemagne's rule. The Saxons would rebel again, but the tide had turned. With Saxony mostly subdued, Charlemagne turned his gaze to the rest of Europe. In southern Italy, the Duke of Benevento was playing hard to get. Charlemagne marched in, besieged Salerno, and forced the Duke to swear loyalty. It was a diplomatic win wrapped in military muscle. Next, Charlemagne targeted Bavaria, the last autonomous duchy in the Frankish realm. Duke Tassilo III, who had married into Lombard royalty, was summoned to court, tried for treason, and sent to a monastery. No bloodshed, just a staged trial and a one-way ticket to monkhood. With Bavaria annexed, Charlemagne absorbed Carinthia, bringing him into contact with the Avars, a wealthy and warlike people in the Carpathian Basin. The Avars had long raided Europe from their fortress-ringed homeland. Charlemagne's son Pippin of Italy led the charge, and in 796, the Franks sacked the Avar ring, their royal residence, and seized legendary treasure. The Avar Khaganate collapsed. Charlemagne's empire now stretched deep into Pannonia, and the Slavic tribes under Avar rule were converted to Christianity. Charlemagne wasn't done. In 797, he subjugated Croatia, securing the southeastern frontier. In 799, he crushed the Bretons, those stubborn Celts in northwest Gaul, making the map look tidier. He also conquered Barcelona, pushing into northern Spain and establishing the Spanish March as a buffer against the Umayyads. By the cusp of 800, Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, from Barcelona to the Elbe. It was vast, diverse, and unmistakably imperial. Managing this behemoth required more than swords, it needed administration. Charlemagne's government revolved around a mobile royal court, which traveled from palace to palace. But his favorite residence was Aachen, a city of hot springs, scholars, and sacred architecture. At Aachen, he built a Palatine chapel, modeled after Byzantine grandeur. He established a palace school, led by Alcuin of York, where nobles and clergy were educated. He created a library, importing manuscripts from Rome, Ravenna, and Monte Cassino. He issued capitularies, legal decrees that standardized governance across the empire. Aachen wasn't the capital in a modern sense, but it was the spiritual and intellectual heart of the Carolingian world. Charlemagne didn't just conquer, he reformed. He standardized Christian liturgy, rooting out pagan practices. He improved the morals and education of clergy, making literacy a requirement for faith. He summoned synods to legislate religious policy, blending church and state like wine and bread. He promoted Carolingian minuscule, a clear script that preserved classical texts and shaped modern writing. His reign saw a cultural revival, the Carolingian Renaissance, that laid the foundation for medieval Europe. By the year 800, Charlemagne had conquered most of Western and Central Europe. But ruling it, that was a whole different beast. So he did what any visionary emperor would do. He divided the kingdom into counties, administrative districts called pagi, each governed by a count. These counts were responsible for collecting taxes, raising troops, administering justice, keeping the peace. But Charlemagne didn't trust anyone too much, so he created a brilliant system of imperial oversight, the Missi Dominici, Latin for envoys of the Lord. And no, not that Lord. The Lord here was Charlemagne himself, not the divine upstairs. Each Massaticum district was visited 4 times a year by a pair of inspectors, one ecclesiastical, usually a bishop, one secular, usually a count. Their job? To sniff out corruption, enforce royal edicts, and report back to Charlemagne. They were like medieval secret agents with holy water and scrolls. Charlemagne was deeply pious and saw himself as a new King Josiah, responsible for the moral health and salvation of his people. But the church was a mess. Illiterate clergy, sloppy rituals, and theological confusion. So in 789 he issued the Admonitio Generalis, a sweeping capitulary, royal edict, that standardized Christian practices across the empire, mandated education for clergy, ordered the creation of schools in every bishopric and monastery, required the correction and copying of religious texts, declared the Christian nature of the kingdom immutable. This wasn't just about faith, it was about discipline, order, and salvation through knowledge. Charlemagne believed you couldn't be a good Christian unless you knew what a good Christian was. So he launched a cultural revival that would echo through the centuries. He summoned scholars from across Europe, Alcuin of York from Northumbria, Paul the Deacon from Lombard Italy, Einhard, a Frankish scholar, who would write the life of Charles the Great. He founded schools in Metz, Tours, St. Gall, and more. He standardized the curriculum, grammar, rhetoric, music, astronomy, and created Carolingian minuscule, a new script that introduced lowercase letters, spaces between words, punctuation, finally. This made texts easier to read and copy, leading to a massive increase in literacy and the preservation of classical works. Charlemagne himself studied Latin later in life and may have dabbled in Greek. He probably wasn't illiterate, but he wasn't winning any spelling bees either. In 799, Pope Leo III was attacked by Roman nobles who tried to blind him and tear out his tongue. He fled to Charlemagne, who escorted him back to Rome and held a council to clear his name. Then, on Christmas Day 800, Charlemagne knelt in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica. Suddenly, Leo placed a crown on his head and declared him emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne was reportedly surprised and annoyed. He hadn't asked for it. But the symbolism was clear. The Western Roman Empire was reborn. The Pope now had the power to crown emperors. The Byzantine Empire, ruled by Empress Irene, was not amused. Some historians debate whether Charlemagne was the first Holy Roman Emperor, or whether that title belongs to Otto I in 962. But people at the time saw no difference. The coronation was a political earthquake. Charlemagne's relationship with the Muslim powers was a mix of swordplay and sweet talk. While he had skirmishes with the Umayyads in Spain, he also exchanged gifts with the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who sent him an elephant named Abul Abbas, because nothing says diplomatic flex like a royal pachyderm. In Catalonia, the Franks pushed southward, establishing footholds in Barcelona and Pamplona, expanding their influence. But Charlemagne wasn't trying to reclaim lost Christian lands. No reconquista here. He was all about conquista, converting pagans and Muslims alike to save their souls. By 812, Charlemagne had a problem. The Byzantine Empire, still kicking in the east, wasn't thrilled about his shiny new title of Emperor of the Romans, especially since Empress Irene had been deposed and Venice was still under Byzantine sway. So Charlemagne did what any savvy emperor would do. He parked an army near Venice, gave the Byzantines a good long stare, and waited. Eventually, they blinked. In 812, the Byzantines recognized Charlemagne as the legitimate emperor in the West, a diplomatic win that gave his crown some serious street cred. Just as Charlemagne was basking in imperial glory, the Danes showed up like uninvited guests at a royal banquet. Except instead of wine, they brought raids. In 810, Danish King Godfred launched attacks along the Frisian coast, even threatening Venice. Charlemagne responded with coastal defenses, fortresses, and fleets. But the Viking threat was just beginning. His successors would face full-blown invasions, especially in the 830s. On January 28, 814, Charlemagne died in Aachen, aged 70. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from Rome to the North Sea. But his grand plans for succession hit a snag. His son Pippin had died in 811. Only Louis the Pious remained. Louis inherited the empire but lacked his father's iron grip. He tried to keep things together, but eventually divided the realm among his sons, leading to the Kingdom of France in the west, the Holy Roman Empire in the east. Charlemagne is remembered as a conqueror who expanded Christendom, a reformer who standardized church practices, a patron of learning who launched the Carolingian Renaissance, a Christian king who believed it was his duty to convert pagans by force, including the brutal massacre of 4,500 Saxons who refused baptism. His reign was built on the foundations laid by Charles Martel and Pippin the Short, but Charlemagne took it to mythic heights. After his death, he became the father figure of medieval Europe, revered by kings, popes, and scholars alike. History isn't just a list of dates and dusty names, it's the heartbeat of who we are. At Dark Crown Chronicle, we don't just tell stories, we resurrect empires, breathe life into forgotten kings, and walk you through the fire and glory of the past. If Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire stirred something in you, curiosity, awe, maybe even goosebumps, then you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe and unlock a world where empires rise and fall before your eyes, with cinematic storytelling and stunning visuals. Complex history becomes clear, engaging, and unforgettable. Battles, betrayals, and coronations are brought to life with drama and depth. You learn while being entertained. Perfect for students, history buffs, and curious minds alike. You join a growing community of thinkers, dreamers, and time travelers who crave more than surface-level content. Every episode is crafted with passion, precision, and a touch of dark intrigue, because history deserves more than a textbook. So if you believe the past still speaks, if you want to understand the roots of power, faith, and legacy, subscribe to Dark Crown Chronicle. Let's uncover the shadows of history together. Hit that bell. The next legend awaits.